When you were growing up, did you learn in school that humans evolved from apes? Or that every living creature we know of crawled out of some kind of primordial ooze? The debate over creation and evolution is age-old, but since this year is the 100th anniversary of the famous Scopes trial, affectionately known as the monkey trial, we thought we'd revisit not only what should be taught in schools, but also what's true at all. Are you team creation, team evolution, old earth, young earth, something in the middle? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. We are, of course, an offshoot of Theology by the Pint, a ministry here in Houston where we talk about all kinds of fun and nerdy and interesting things, from philosophy to theology to faith and culture, culture wars, sometimes politics. We dive into it all. And then here in the podcast, we get to dive even deeper and nerd out even more. If you listen at all to our podcast, you're familiar with our guest today, which I'll introduce in just a second. But first, everything you need to know about all of our events, how you can give, upcoming 10-year anniversary of our organization, all of that kind of stuff you can find on theologybythepint.org. Just like it sounds, theologybythepint.org. Go check that out. And hey, if you enjoy the podcast, give a little bit to help us keep going and help us keep running these events. But this is the first time I'm going to say this on the air, Sarah Stone Ulrich. Recently married and name change. Yes, thank you for the golf clap. I'm the executive director for Theology by the Pint. I'm joined today by two of our kind of regular on the podcast and at our events. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Ken. I'm an accountant. Not super equipped to argue the science side of this, but I'm a science nerd. Kind of like, that one friend that's super into like baseball stats. That's kind of how I am with science. I'm not really a scientist, but I geek out about stuff like this. So,
and Ken is on our board and likely will be the one handing you beer tickets if you come to our events. So he's a good guy to know. And you are?
Hi, I'm Max. I have a background in science exhibit design and a little bit of involvement in paleontological digs, digging up dinosaurs.
So Max was actually the speaker at one of our recent events about creation and evolution. He was on the side of young earth or 6-day creationism, and he brought dinosaur bones with him. So he charmed the audience with those. Even those that disagreed were like, I want to see the dinosaur bones.
Yeah, cheated a little bit.
But I grew up, my dad's a pastor, and I grew up going to public school. And so in school, I learned about evolution, Big Bang Theory, evolution, Darwinianism, survival of the fittest, on and on. And then at home and at church, my parents would say, oh, no, that's not true. The truth is creationism and just creation. I'm listening. Before we started, he said, don't say creationism, but just creation, that God created the world and in his infinite power. And so I just grew up I believed my parents, but I was taught something else at school. And then we also learned in history about this famous trial, the Scopes trial. I called it the monkey trial because that was more fun. That had to do with what we can teach people in school. So before we get into all the nitty gritty on evolution and creation, Ken, why don't you start us off by just giving us an overview of what was the Scopes trial? Why was it important? All of that.
We'll ping pong back and forth because if I get anything wrong, let me know. So there was this substitute teacher, John Scopes. When the ACLU was looking to contest this law, Bradford, what was the law name?
The
Bradley? Bradford? Butler, thank you. The Butler Act, which prohibited the teaching of this newfangled evolutionary theory in schools in Tennessee. This substitute teacher named Scopes raised his hand and is like, yeah, I'll be the civil disobedience guy who says, yeah, I probably taught this. I don't even know if I did, but I'll be the punching bag for the biggest lawyer in America at the time, William Jennings Bryant, who ran for president like 3 times. And the defense had this other hotshot fireball attorney named Clarence Darrow. And very quickly, the trial snowballed away from, are you allowed to teach this in school or not according to the laws of Tennessee? And it snowballed into tons of ad hominem, tons of like, well, your grandfather was a monkey, my grandfather was a human. Right?
Wow.
All sorts of really, really fun stuff. The court became a circus. They had monkeys outside performing. Everyone was packed into a blazing hot courtroom in 1925, and it's probably what killed William Jennings Bryant because he died like a week after.
Yes.
So
wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
Probably from.
I didn't know about the monkeys or any of that.
Oh, it was a circus.
Huh.
Every
Circus
newspaper
monkeys.
in the country was talking about it. Yeah.
I mean, I knew it was famous, and I knew it was called the monkey, but I assumed it was called the monkey trial because, we came from monkeys, ostensibly. And,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is back when the ACLU was cool, right?
Right.
They
Well-
would go on to like defend the Nazis in Skogan. So like, we disagree with you, but we defend your right to say it, right? Now the ACLU is a bunch of pansies, but back then they had some stones. Yeah.
There we go.
Thoughts?
Well, that's all. I think that's all pretty much correct. The term monkey trial was actually coined by pretty much America's premier journalist at the time, H.L. Mencken, who he was an acerbic, just condescending master of the English language. But he was very flippant about it because he looked at disdain at these southern country bumpkins who held onto their Bible, clinging to their guns and religion, wherever you heard that before. And so he dubbed this contest over the law about teaching evolution, he called it the monkey trial, and it stuck. And in fact, it stuck so quickly and so deeply that by the time he traveled down to Tennessee to attend the trial himself, like Ken said, there were trained chimpanzees in the streets performing, and there were lines up and down the street of vendors selling lemonade. It was a circus, and it was more than a circus. This entire trial, from the very beginning, was a coordinated, choreographed, what do they call it? Publicity stunt.
Yeah.
So what you had was in 1925, in March of 1925, the Butler Act was signed into law by the governor of Tennessee. And I have the language of the bill right here. It's very short. It says, "Being enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Tennessee, that it shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals," which is teaching colleges, "and other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals." Now, nowhere in the body of this law does it even mention evolution. You could legally teach the evolution of animals in a classroom. What you could not do.
Oh, human evolution.
Yeah, exactly. You
Okay.
could not say that man descended from
Interesting.
animals. And so the ACLU was looking to not only defeat this law, but to take it to a national stage and get it struck down for every state. They were looking to lose the monkey trial so that they could take it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court could make it legal across the entire United States to teach human evolution in public schools.
On day like 6 or 7, Scopes and Darrow just like gave up and said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we broke the law. By the way, we were just trying to get this out in the open to say that it's an unjust law."
Exactly. So
Right.
the ACLU wanted it to go public so they could strike it down on a national level. And in fact, that is what set up William Jennings Bryan's great defeat. Bryan had worked for weeks on his closing statement, but at the
they gave
last
up.
day of the
Yeah.
trial, Clarence Darrow stood up and said, "We ask for a guilty verdict. We rescind our right to make a closing statement," which by Tennessee state law meant that
Both
Bryan
sides, yeah.
could not make his closing statement. So
By the
this-
way, I do have to point out the irony that on the 7th day they rested.
That's
oh,
funny.
that's pretty.
That's pretty funny.
Keep going. Keep going.
If they did that on purpose,
Oh.
that's pretty funny.
That's incredible. I never thought of that.
Anyway, continue.
So
Sorry.
anyway, so at the same time, you had some lawyers or businessmen from this tiny little town of
It was a
Dayton.
tiny
It
town.
was so small.
Yeah.
They were just hanging out in Chattanooga, which at the time was sort of the big city, and they saw the ad in the paper by the ACLU saying, "We're looking for a science teacher to challenge this law."
Yeah.
To more or less confess that you broke the law and we can make a case out of it. And they said, "This would be great for our little town."
Oh,
And
interesting.
Oh,
so-
really?
And so they got together with the ACLU. Well, H.L. Mencken heard of it. H.L. Mencken, who's this really sort of the evil mastermind behind this whole thing, he said, "I know who you need to get for defense," and that's Clarence Darrow, who the year before, 1924, was the defense attorney for the most famous, notorious, and hated trial of that year, which was two Jewish boys called the Leopold and Loeb case. Two Jewish boys, 19 and 20 at the time, murdered one of their relatives because they thought, simply because they were bored and thought they could get away with it.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, wow.
And they were the most hated men in America. Clarence Darrow was their defense attorney.
Jeez.
And so Darrow had already made a huge name for himself the year before. William Jennings Bryan heard of this trial, and even though he hadn't practiced law for 30 years,
wow.
he said, "This is my righteous cause," and he jumped on it. So you have the most famous defense attorney in America and one of the most famous sort of fundamentalist Christian icons
Prosecutors, yeah,
and three-time presidential nominee, candidate, actually. Together in the same small town. Well, thousands of people flocked to the
Yeah.
small town. They had between 22 and 65 telegraphers
Huh.
come in. They strung thousands of wires of thousands of miles of telegraphy wire in. They even either built or modified the local airport to be able to fly out the footage every night to news agencies. It was also the very first trial in American history to be broadcast over the radio. This was the
Wow.
first really public spectacle of a trial, and it began as a coordinated publicity stunt.
Yeah.
And it was
Fascinating.
it was probably the earliest trial with that much footage filmed, because
Oh.
this was like right at the beginning of the 19th century. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So I understand that it was started as a publicity stunt, and they were trying to sort of go against this Butler Act or Butler
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
But was the hope that they would teach exclusively human evolution in schools, or that they could just add it to the repertoire, as if to say, like, when I teach my women's Bible study and we hit something in Scripture where there's debate, say Revelation,
Mhm.
I will say, like, hey, there's several theories. Here's what they are, and then you can read and you can kind of decide for yourself. And so I would think that's what schools would do. They'd say, hey, there's several theories about, where humans came from. Some people believe this, some people believe that.
Mhm.
But was it to actually stop creation from being taught?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the scope, LOL, of their complaint was just that it was an unjust law, right? It was simply, this law is unjust. They weren't actually saying this is what we should teach, this is what we shouldn't.
Right.
It was just like, there shouldn't be a state law that mandates one way or another. I
Okay.
think it was a very narrow scope.
That was that's a fairly good assessment. It's saying this law is unjust, and in fact, the only time John Scopes stood up and spoke at the very end was saying, "I believe
Yes.
this is an unjust law, and I will continue to fight it."
Right.
Um,
And I'll pay the $100 fee, which was like $2,000 nowadays.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's hefty, but it's not crazy.
For a substitute teacher, that would have been probably a problem.
But in fact, the ACLU, their whole goal was to lose so they could take it to
Right.
a higher
Yeah.
court. But in fact, when it went to a higher Tennessee court, the Tennessee court found that, the judge imposed a $100 fine, and the judge is only legally able to impose a $50 fine. A $100 fine has to be imposed by the jury, and so they threw it out on a technicality.
Oh my
so the
gosh.
ACLU is like, oh shoot, we're back to square one.
That's so bizarre.
But I thought he eventually did. I guess it was that technicality that eventually overturned his
Well, the law
penalty?
wasn't struck down until 1967.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so this all happened in 1925,
Mhm.
and then in 1967, what happened?
Well,
The-
the law was overturned.
Okay,
But one
such
of the
that
so-
they could teach human evolution in
right.
schools.
So to answer your question, it was according to the strict language of the law, which I have here in front of me. It is prohibiting that anyone teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. So I guess
So you could actually still teach something like evolution if you couched it in terms of this is how God chose to create us, right? I mean, this is kind of what theistic evolutionists do today.
I imagine the creationists at the time would probably have a problem with half of the young Earth creationists these days teaching created kinds, right? Which
Probably,
also has
yeah.
descent with modification. Just
Define
within
what you're saying. You're saying a lot of big words. What is
you
what's happening?
talk about created kinds.
Well, in
Yeah.
the speech I gave earlier, I'd mentioned something called the created kinds theory, which is sort of a compromise, although if it's true, it's true.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which says that, say, like bears, all species of bears descend from an original sort of progenitor bear species.
Okay.
Whereas macroevolution would say, well, the bear itself descended from something that was not a bear.
Right.
And it could continue to evolve until they're no longer bears or something. else
Right. From a
entirely.
whale to Beyonce.
And
Yeah.
and if you look at like Answers in Genesis, their chart
Right.
about created kinds, it doesn't exactly map to this, but like the taxonomy,
Yeah.
kingdom, order, or no, kingdom, phylum, class,
order, family, genus, species.
Exactly, right? They usually draw the line of created kinds, not all the time, but like most of the time it's like order or suborder.
It's at
right?
family.
Yeah, family, even lower.
Mhm.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which I will say, like even as a young Earth creationist, we still do not understand speciation very well. In fact,
I want to get into that.
I was talking to a
Yeah.
guy from the museum in Kentucky,
Mhm.
Ken Ham's place, and I said, well, we've never seen a new species arise just from breeding. And he said, actually, we have.
Kinda. Like you
what?
mentioned bears,
Well,
right?
well, there may be some bears. Specifically, what he mentioned were two species of finches, two distinct species that mated together, created a hybrid, but the hybrid was not sterile like most hybrids are. It was fertile, and the hybrid refused to mate with either of the parent
But
species.
only other hybrids.
Only other hybrids.
Whoa.
And so,
Just like the Nephilim. Okay,
well,
that's a teaser for another
and
podcast.
so
sorry.
admittedly, even as a young Earth creationist, we don't
Yeah.
fully understand speciation or how it fits into the necessarily biblical narrative.
The genetic
cleanly.
drift in bears, for example, is a perfect example because you have grizzlies and polars that do often, when the climate gets just right, create hybrids. Pisleys exist.
Pisleys?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's a
In fact, I
weird
think
name.
the only bear that can't create hybrids is the panda, right? And the rest of them can create hybrids with other Ursa groups.
Yeah.
Yes.
Huh.
So we see that if you'll buy into my evolutionary mentality for just a minute, you do see that genetic drift happening right now. We're in the middle of genetic drift from an evolutionary perspective. And if you believe in the created kinds theory that you were just mentioning, even that accounts for some genetic drift too.
It can. Absolutely.
To the extent of speciation, which if pandas are within the Ursa created kind, well, they've already speciated out.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
And it may be going extinct.
Excuse me. And all of
Potentially,
this
and-
that we're talking about has to do with species and light. I mean, we're not talking about like when the universe was created and, natural disasters and lakes and continents and all that stuff. We're actually just talking about like
The law didn't talk
animals
about
and-
that.
but so let me ask you this. Ken. So if it hasn't been clear, I should have said this at the beginning. Ken is sort of repping for team evolution. Max is repping for team creation. Both are Christians. But Ken, do you think then that humans descended from apes?
I do. I do want to build some.
That is so rude.
No, I do.
No, I'm joking.
I want to build some common ground because, like, Max and I are both obsessed with biodiversity. Like, we both think it's kind of the coolest thing ever. Max makes these shirts, which are awesome.
Oh,
It's
you're
all
wearing his shirt?
Yeah, it's the megafauna of Texas.
I'm
It's-
flattered.
Yeah, it's the megafauna of Texas. Go to his Mollusk Man website. Dude is obsessed with the Helicade variety of mollusk.
Helicidae, yeah.
Helicidae. Sorry, I've only ever read the word.
That's funny.
Yeah, we both think biodiversity is really, really cool. Like you said, we both give God the creator credit for this insane biodiversity. We just kind of disagree on
How?
the how,
Right.
Neither of us thinks the other one's stupid. We think it's just extremely important to ground our beliefs in the real world. And like, I think the only disagreement we have is like when we're looking at evidence in the real world, we have a threshold. Like when we see fossil record evidence, for example, we each have a threshold of where we're going to put Genesis into a different genre bucket, right?
Right.
For you, that genre bucket is still in like historical narrative,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And for me, I've met my threshold to move that into a different genre bucket,
Mythopoeic, something like
which
that.
doesn't mean like I'm further along no, you're way smarter than I am with fossils. But I'm just saying my threshold was earlier than yours. I saw like the Australopith and the Homo florensis and Homo
Right.
habilis. I was like, okay, that kind of does it for me for the human evolution, right? It's met my threshold. I can no longer believe in, the created kind of human.
Right.
Yeah.
So, not to, I guess I've already probably tipped my hand, but I hear that and I think, so you took something from scientific research and made that the standard by which you decided what you thought about Genesis, rather than taking what you read in Genesis and using that as the standard.
Well,
that
but
you
we do the
sort
same
of
thing with
applied to-
history and Revelation, right? When we look at the historical record around 70 AD of the destruction of the temple, and then we read Revelation, right? Would you say I'm using the historical record to read into Revelation? No, the plain text of Revelation is probably
Plain
gonna.
text is a hard term. to
That's
use
what
for
I'm
Revelation.
saying, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So we do this genre and we look at the real world and then we bucket the genre. It's like, okay, well, St. John of Patmos probably wasn't talking about something that's going to happen in the 21st century, right? He was probably talking about stuff that happened in, around 70 AD
Very
destruction of the temple.
demonstrably, yeah.
You and I both agree on that, but that's kind of because we know history, right? If we just had the Bible as plain text, right, we wouldn't be able to put this apocalyptic genre on that.
Well, there are also internal clues from the text, the
Sure.
use of like temporal language, like it's happening soon, the
In this
fact that it's
generation,
addressed,
yeah.
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I do agree, like a good understanding of history within the especially as it relates to when these texts were written, extremely useful for deciphering things which might not be obvious just from the text itself.
You have a threshold though, right? Like there is going to be in the future some hypothetical archaeological, paleontological evidence that would cause you to move Genesis into a different genre.
Could,
You
not
just
will.
you
Sure.
like I said, we both look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
You have not met. You don't think that evidence has been found yet, or it doesn't exist. But if it were to be found, that would meet your threshold.
Mm-hmm.
You would bucket it in a different genre, right?
Well, I would.
Great question.
That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
I think I would have to preface it by saying I'd need to really think and define what that threshold would
Okay.
be. But I'm sure that there would be at some point some just surefire bit of evidence to be like, well, shoot, now I got to reevaluate.
Okay, yeah.
And neither of
like-
you would say this is a sort of salvific hill you're going to die on.
No.
People don't go to heaven because they don't have the right
I
view.
think it has major consequences
Yes.
long term. But I don't believe it's a salvific issue at all.
I actually really hate that we are taught that in at least in the kind of church that I grew
See,
up
I
in.
was never taught that.
It was like either all of the Bible's true or none of it's true, and then like people look at Homo florensis, Homo habilis. They learn about like
I've never heard these words before. Let me just put that out there.
well, it's the what comes like after Australopiths, like Lucy,
Oh, yes,
right?
Yeah.
sure.
Well,
Mhm.
you know what I'm talking about.
Hey guys, Sarah Stone here. Sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a riveting podcast episode, but Theology by the Pint needs your help to continue providing these podcasts, offering our in-person events, and growing so we can bring thoughtful conversation and the hope of the gospel to a world that's increasingly walking away from church and from faith. Now that we're a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations are tax deductible. So we've crunched the numbers. And if each listener of this episode gave just $1 for each episode you listen to, we'd put a huge dent in our annual budget. So consider giving today. Go to theologybythePint.org/give and click the link to donate. Thanks so much. And now back to our show.
Just like looking at the fossil record of hominid, human,
Yeah.
ape.
I know that word.
Yeah, hominid, skulls, hips, feet.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Hominid fossils convince some people that
Yeah.
there is not necessarily a like common, what's it called, a missing link,
Yeah.
but that like one of the dumbest things about evolution is that the critics, and you probably hate this when creationists say, well, if we evolved from monkeys, why are monkeys still here? Right? You hate that, don't you?
It's
Because that's not what evolutionists believe.
Right.
It's descent with modification, so
Mhm.
it's going to look like a crepe myrtle tree,
right.
Mhm.
right? Where everything very quickly fractals out into
Mhm,
new
mhm.
branches and new branches.
Mhm.
And just because we find, like, the flowers on these branches might represent different archaeological findings, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that this flower is a descendant of that flower, but that somewhere further along the tree, they would have shared a common ancestor.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, well, but what about the future argument about, maybe there's no sort of sorry. Some people say there's no in between these species, right? Where's the in between pick two things?
Or
But
there's a thousand
also,
in-betweens.
but then
Yeah.
the other thing is on the future end of it, are we still evolving? Is there going to be some sort of superhuman or some other thing to come, do you think?
I think that depends on your definition of evolution.
Well, I'm asking Ken because I think we're a special thing that God created that
Oh,
I
so-
don't think we descended from apes.
I actually still think that too. But
Okay.
I think we descended from apes. But I do think we are a very special thing that God created.
Do you think
Um,
we're the ultimate
I
creation?
I think probably the arrival of Jesus in the biggest empire in the world, if you don't count the American Empire, Evan.
Oh my gosh.
The biggest,
Evan's producing our show today, so he's in the room.
yeah. The arrival of Jesus in the most like brutal, conquering, bloodthirsty empire in the world, it kind of signals to me that like humans were the point of all of this, and that God has a very
Mhm.
special salvific plan for humans that is different than the animal world.
Yeah.
Right.
So you don't think there's going to be, a million years from now, something that is not human that came from humans, and they'll be having their own argument about, do you think we came from humans?
It's interesting you say that. There's in evolutionary theory, there's a saying, you don't outgrow your ancestry, meaning like we will still be humans, but like humans might split off into different speciations, but they'll still be humans. They'll just be subgroups of humans that may not even be able to interbreed with other subgroups of humans because they've speciated away, right? The paradox, what is a fish?
I don't.
Right. Oh, well, it's just that the idea of like when you look at the bony fishes, the
Mhm.
cartilaginous fishes, the jaw fishes, like
All very different.
all very different, but a very broad category, but they're still fishes.
Right.
And then you look like mud skippers or like fish that are currently in that in between land and sea phase, or land and freshwater for
Yes.
mud skippers. It seems that they are becoming another type of fish, right?
Okay.
Which eventually, somehow, if you take evolutionary theory to be true,
Mhm.
some where along the way that happened and became like an amphibian and a reptile, and then the reptile became right. That there,
I've seen the bumper sticker.
but they would still, in that in between phase, have the characteristics of fish, right? Which is, it's just a weird thing to think about. That like in the nested hierarchy, like a crepe myrtle tree, there's one of these branches that was fish
Mhm.
until it wasn't, but like
Mhm.
it's still in that fish tree,
Hmm.
right? It still comes off of the fish branch.
Okay.
So at what point along the way do we stop calling it a fish? Right,
Okay,
even though it comes off of that branch of fish.
Yeah.
It's a weird paradox that nobody has an answer to.
Here's a question for you, Max. So Ken said that when he looked at all of the scientific discovery and fossil record and all this kind of stuff, and the homo, whatever, all of this, that he had to kind of change the way he thought about Genesis and his threshold for what
Sure.
bucket of literature he was in. What for you was sort of the deciding factor or factors that led you to land in creationism?
Well, I suppose growing up, it was sort of this big mix of evolutionary education from the museum side, and then Bible school or whatever. It's more of the, I guess, sort of a watered down sort of creation where they tell you what the Bible says, but then they can't really back it up. And then eventually I found the middle ground where you have people who actually do the science who still uphold what the Bible says and will point to many, many evidences that say, okay, this supports a biblical account of creation. So I think it was more or less the overwhelming abundance of evidence in favor of the biblical creation model compared to the evidence for evolution.
Okay.
I think that more or less won me over from being sort of an edgy, like, yeah, I'm a Christian, I believe in evolution, to being like, at the time, I had no idea what I was talking about. And then to be like, no, I admit it. I admit I was wrong about that, and the Bible was true, and the young Earth model seems to be, I mean, it's not only biblically aligned with what the Word of God says, but it's also aligned with what the scientific evidence shows, at least in my experience.
And that's what's so crazy about this whole argument is that you can talk to people like you who can show you, I'm sure, 1,000 ways that the science backs up your theory. And Ken, you can show me 1,000 ways that the science, quote, backs up your theory. And so then the rest of us are left going, well, what does the science actually say? What does the fossil record say? And
I have a
it's kind of
threshold in the
confusing.
other direction, though, right?
Yeah.
Like if we started finding rabbits or ungulates in the Cambrian,
Yeah.
well, I mean, then
Stay
shoot.
with the Cambrian explosion.
Well, the Cambrian geologic
layer.
strata,
Right.
right? We call it the Cambrian explosion because it's where all of these different the biodiversity inside the ocean started to really, really spread out, and really you saw the crepe myrtle start to fracture a lot. But like if we started seeing rabbits like nested firmly in the Cambrian, or like ungulates or
Yeah.
panda bears like in the Cambrian, then like I would have to change my mind. Australia, for example, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
If we found like joeys and kangaroos on their way from Mount Ararat in Turkey to Australia,
Right.
you know, I would start changing my mind,
Sure.
right? There is a threshold in the other direction. What kind of threshold in the evolution direction would it take for you?
You know, I'd have to think about that a
Yeah.
little bit, but I think I would go back to maybe the three challenges I posed in my speech. One of
For
which
those
was,
that weren't there, yeah, tell us.
let's see, the biggest one is prove that physical death is not a result of sin, mankind's sin, from biblically. Now that's not scientific; that's
Okay.
more theological. If that could be proven, that would really throw a wrench in my
And that was kind of
approach.
what did it for me when I kind of came to keep going. Yeah.
But there are also evidences within the geological record that kind of throw the evolution model for a loop.
Okay.
I believe I mentioned the polystrate fossils, which polystrate meaning mini strata. We have fossil trees that are implanted vertically through multiple layers of rock strata. And when you look at the rock strata, the geologist will say, it took millions of years for each of these layers to form. Well, when you have a fossil tree growing up through multiple of these layers, do we have any trees that can live for 30 million years? Not as far as I know. And so that sort of throws a wrench in that idea, saying, okay, well, maybe we have to reevaluate how old these layers are or how fast they were deposited.
Lithification of sedimentary layers, right?
Yes.
And how fast that occurs normally versus how fast it could occur in either a global flood or in the case of
cataclysmic event.
some of these trees, right? A local flood or something.
Yeah. And that's not to mention the fact that some of these trees have unfossilized, they're partly fossilized and partly unfossilized.
Ooh.
Oh,
In
interesting.
fact, there was one tree, just one tree, that when people found it was petrified on one side, coalified, turned to coal, and then soft on the other side.
Link that in the YouTube chat. I would love to see links to that.
I will
Yeah.
find the documents on that one.
Yeah.
Interesting. And this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but just because so many people asked and we didn't get to it at the event, you also, Max, believe, correct me if I'm wrong,
Mhm.
that humans and dinosaurs coexisted.
Yes.
So we have to talk about dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Come on. It's so fun.
No, Answers in Genesis has Jesus, or not Jesus, but like Adam and Eve, like with a
Riding
velociraptor,
dinosaurs.
and
Yeah.
like
So maybe say a little bit about that. And I realize I cut you off. I think you gave 1 of 3 points, and I'm already asking.
Well, I was
about
trying to remember
dinosaurs.
the other two, to be honest.
Okay, well, if they
Um,
come back to you, weave them in.
Oh,
But
death Death in Genesis. I want to talk about that
Sure.
after you're done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
dinosaurs first, Ken.
Dinosaurs
Which is
first.
dinosaurs first. Well, since I believe that land creatures, and including human beings, were made on the 6th day of creation, I believe that dinosaurs and man were created at the same time and thus inhabited the earth at the same time. There are
And there was no death.
well, at the time there was no death, and then but we fast forward after the fall of man,
Yeah.
the introduction of sin, which led evil and death.
And decay and suffering.
Well,
Yeah.
that's when you get. That's when you get chaos, and we do actually have some archaeological artifacts that depict dinosaurs attacking and consuming humans.
Hmm.
We have numerous artifacts that just simply depict dinosaurs.
You talking about the footprints?
Not the footprints, but I mean
interesting.
like actual ancient art.
Oh, okay.
Tapestries, pottery, stuff like that. And in fact, some of these depictions are anatomically accurate down to the number of spines on the animal's back.
Wow.
One of the lesser known ones, it's a stone that was called an Ica stone. These come out of Peru. They're either acid etched or cut with an iron tool. But a lot of them depict very strange, almost anachronistic things. One of them depicts brain surgery. Many of them depict dinosaur-looking creatures. One of them depicted an animal called an Amargasaurus. And this is it's a long neck, long tail plant eater, and it has these wild, radical spines coming out of its neck. It looks like a punk rocker. The thing is, the stone was discovered in the 1920s and put on display in a museum for decades. Amargasaurus wasn't discovered until the 1980s.
Ooh.
Interesting.
But the stone matches the skeleton of the animal perfectly.
Link that in the YouTube chat too.
I'll do it.
Max has a new job and it's just linking
I
things.
just-
in the...
And this is just a couple of
Mhm.
examples. There are many, many.
Interesting.
Wasn't Margosaurus in the same like geographic location as the Incans, or would it have been-
Roughly, Amargasaurus
Okay.
was found in Argentina. Then the Ica stones are found in Peru.
Okay, I mean that's not
So
Pretty close.
So not
Yeah.
like there's a couple thousand
It's not
miles
like it's
between
China,
them,
you know.
but yeah.
Well, I'm still South America, right? It's,
Yes.
it's not landlocked in one place and then
Sure.
the fossil found in another.
And what do you make of the whole dinosaur thing? You don't think that's true? That man and dinosaurs lived at the same time?
Do you count birds as dinosaurs?
No.
But I mean, it's like you don't outgrow what you used to be. You don't outgrow your ancestry. I mean, like if you count birds as descendant of the not sauropods, but like the
Theropod.
the theropods,
Mhm.
yeah, then yeah, dinosaurs would have been the branch in the crepe myrtle that went into birds.
Mhm.
But
Okay.
no, I don't think like the
T-Rex.
Tyrannosaur, the great lizard. Right? I
Mhm.
don't think that would have been
Yeah.
around the same time as
All right.
humans.
Well, we don't have to get too
Yeah.
in the weeds on that. I just wanted the audience to hear you talk a little bit about it because it is kind of interesting.
Sure, and I'll take it a step further. I believe
Okay.
that some dinosaurs exist, live, breathe today
Ooh.
in remote corners of the world, and I would love to go look for them at
the
some point.
sauropod in the Congo.
Mokele Mbembe in the Congo.
Yeah,
But in fact, there's been reports out of Mexico, out of Brazil,
Mhm.
even certain parts of North America.
And
Huh.
that
Wow.
would definitely. I don't think it would change my mind on human evolution, but that would definitely like cause. You probably win. I don't know, some sort of prize for science for finding that thing.
Mm.
That thing has been the what's it called Mothman.
The white whale?
Oh, it'd be the
Mothman,
smoking gun.
Mothman,
Crypt-
Bigfoot,
cryptozoology?
cryptozoologists.
Cryptids,
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's been their gold standard.
That's
for
the
a
holy
long
grail,
time. That's the
absolutely.
holy grail of cryptozoology.
Okay, Max, if you
Yeah.
find these creatures and you become famous and rich, remember us when and make a generous donation to Theology by the Pint.
It's just called the
Can
Theology
you
by
put
the
a commercial right
Pintosaurus.
there?
If you
I'm
could
kidding.
find the Congo sauropod, man.
I do believe that in God's providence, He does conceal and reveal things like that so it could be we go the rest of our lifetimes and not make that discovery. But as you know, the world's sort of getting smaller and smaller. Cameras are getting more and more prolific. I think it's only a matter of time. But like anything else, it's going to be in God's sovereignty when He reveals where those creatures are and
Do you
why.
think that he conceals in part for the joy of the process of discovery?
I think so.
Does that also include fossils?
I do think so because
Okay, cool.
up until like let's say the early 1800s, dinosaurs as we know them today virtually unknown. They would plow up a bone now and then, say, oh, it's a dragon bone, anecdotal stuff.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the study and rediscovery of these fascinating animals only we were, I would say, providentially permitted to rediscover them in the 1800s through the fossils. And of course, ever since then, they've more or less been used as a giant mallet to pound the evolutionary theory. But I believe that will change.
Interesting. Okay, you wanted to go back to the sin and death thing, or did you have something else teed up?
Yeah. So you were looking for biblical evidence, which like I can't provide you evidence other than like genre shift. But but if there were archaeological evidence, here would be one thing that would shift my genre. I mentioned like joeys and kangaroos on their way from Ararat to
Say why you're saying for our listeners, Ararat is where the Bible says that Noah's Ark came to rest.
landed in Turkey, somewhere in the mountains of Turkey, right? And marsupial mammals are kind of the only types of mammals, except for a couple monotremes like echidnas or platypus.
Right.
They're the only mammals, and bats because they can fly.
Yeah.
But they're the only mammals in Australia, right? And we see like koala bears are as different from like kangaroos or as different from like the Tasmanian tiger. They're not Tasmanian tiger. What was the other marsupial?
Thylacine?
That was in Australia, right?
That was, yes.
In New Zealand or Australia.
Tasmania.
Okay.
Either way, you're saying there's a kind of a unique.
There's a very unique thing about the mammals in that part of the world.
Yes.
Right? That existed in other parts of the world, but only exist or are the only kinds of mammals that exist in Australia. Right? Now, evolution would have predicted that, right? That geographic isolation would have caused one family of marsupials to speciate into dozens, hundreds, millions of different species of marsupials, right? I do have the same threshold for like xenarthrans in South Africa, which are the armadillos and sloths, right?
Yes.
They're isolated to South America, right? Sloths and armadillos and that whole family, even the giant sloths, I put the name of it here, the glyphodont armadillos and like the megatherium sloths that are like 9,000 pounds. These things are huge, right? But still have like the fixed pelvis that we find in all of the other xenarthrans, right? The armadillos and the sloths. If we found those anywhere else, right? If we found those in Turkey on their way through the Levant, on their way through Northern Africa and to South America, before Pangea very quickly spread apart from the flood, right?
Yes.
If you then that would change my evidence. If you could see,
and you're referring to the fossil record, to be clear, right?
Yes,
okay.
which is why I was talking about the fossil record being intentionally hidden from God, right?
Yes.
Like if we did find some of that stuff, I imagine there'd be a lot of other people that would have to change their assumptions.
Do you have a response to why that is not the case? I mean, you don't have to on the fly. You may not have prepared for that, but
well, I would say that the vast majority of the fossil record that we know of was deposited during the flood, not afterwards. Now, there was some afterwards because there were some inland lakes that burst and created titanic tidal waves of, there were some flood activity. But for the most part, you have just the flood.
Kind of trapped in time.
Right. Just the flood event. And then after the flood, you have the animals coming out, mating, migrating, and some people would say rapidly speciating.
And I'm fine pre-flood, right? If the South American habitat, if there was some sort of Pangea pre-flood, I'm fine with that being their habitat, and then the flood wipes them out right there. Same thing with Australia, right? The marsupials, fossil record in Australia, it gets locked into place right there during the flood because that's the geographic habitat they're most comfortable with.
Right.
But the travel from the Ark back to South America, from the Ark back to Australia, right? We don't find that fossil record anywhere.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily because the geological elements necessary for fossilization would not have existed at that time, not unless there were subsequent floods of
That's
massive
what he's saying.
scale.
It's all kind of locked in.
So
around the
what
flood.
you could have is mass migrations of animals.
There's been a ton of mud.
There would have been a ton. Well, but keep in mind the arks, the waters had receded for months before they were even let off the ark. Enough time for plants to replenish. So there would have been mud. You might have found footprints, but mud itself does not create fossils. Being buried under mud and with under certain types of mud, there's some pressure, and especially the presence of water within the mud consistently enough to replace the organic material with minerals.
Calcified mineral. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
The
You might.
fossilization is so rare.
It is extremely rare, and the
Yeah.
only reason we find so many is because the entire world was flooded by a giant tidal wave of mud. And I would say tidal because it wasn't just one big
Right.
tsunami; it was layer after layer after layer after layer.
Fountains of the deep opening up, and
And this is where you get some theories. And just a bunny trail real quick. One of the hardest questions for creationists to answer is why do the animals stratify so consistently? Why, like you said, don't we find rabbits down in the Cambrian,
Right.
but we find them way up top? There's,
Better swimmers, I think you said.
well, there's a swimming theory saying that the larger animals or certain animals were better at escaping the tides, and so that's why all the large dinosaurs were pushed into the central corridor of America. That's why, like Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, it's called the dinosaur corridor. Now that's one theory. Another theory, and there could be multiple factors, but another theory is called specific gravity. If you shoot a duck, the duck will float on the water. If you shoot a loon, which looks exactly like a duck, it will sink to the bottom. You will never
what
get
a
it back.
loon.
And
Sorry, I
yet,
had to-
what kind of birds do we find in the Cretaceous? Loons. Well, I think it's the Cretaceous, but what kind?
Lower.
We find loon birds down in a dinosaur layer.
Is that because they have some sort of swim bladder or something? Or
It's the specific gravity. In fact, there's different
explain specific gravity. I'm not familiar with this concept.
Well, specific gravity is you have different objects or different organisms or different carcasses, to be a little bit more morbid about it, which will float at different points in the water. Some will float right on top.
oh, it's a buoyancy.
It's a
question.
buoyancy
Like
theory.
Okay,
humans.
okay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's buoyancy. Like,
This is why the mafia has to tie rocks to you when they drop you in the East River.
right, and this is how they can identify if a body is too far desiccated in the water. They can tell it's male or female depending on if it's floating on its back or on its stomach. Like it gets
Oh,
really
the fatty
Ladies have the
deposits.
belly fat.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, and other fat.
And other fat.
Well, it gets creepy real fast. But basically, so that's one of the theories is saying that some sank and others floated and others sort of were buoyant sort of right in the middle.
Huh.
And
I'm learning so much today. History about the Scopes trial and science about the fossil record.
But
It's
I-
fantastic.
it's weird because like the buoyancy of mammals versus reptiles
Yeah.
probably wouldn't follow that same pattern though.
Not
But
necessarily.
maybe it would. I did want to go back to the pre-fall death thing.
Yes,
Sure,
You
sure.
said
Me too.
Like I said, I can't answer this with a biblical thing because that's a whole genre question.
Right.
But let's. You've probably heard the dental and the like gut biome debate. Like that's been done to death, right? Why did the Velociraptor have these? They didn't have molars,
Right.
right? How would they have,
Yeah.
shoot up? That's boring. They didn't have the digestive tract to, digest leafy greens the way that cows have 4 stomachs or whatever,
Yeah.
right? And predators have very streamlined gut biomes. That's boring. We don't want to talk about that. What I do want to talk about is like scorpions' tails. Like,
Yes.
would they? Because poison
Yes.
wouldn't have needed to exist pre-fall.
Yes.
But would scorpions have had hollow tails pre-fall in anticipation of some future venom that they would have needed? Also, buzzards and different carrion birds
Yes.
have bald heads, right? Would they, like, pre-fall, why would you have needed to have a bald head for a carrion bird if there was no death, right?
I don't know what you're saying about I get the scorpion thing. But
So the evolutionary theory behind like why buzzards and vultures and have bald heads is because it's bacteria can get inside of feathers a lot easier than it can on like skin, right?
Okay.
Skin will slick away bacteria,
and
and
since they're eating a bunch of dead things all the time,
it's
okay, got it.
evolutionary beneficial for the ones that had some mutation that like makes them bald to like, oh, those carrion birds are now extremely adept at eating dead things,
Right.
whereas the other ones are still getting bacterial
Copy that.
infections.
Okay.
Right? Scorpion's tail, same situation. If there's no death before the fall, there's no poison. So why would a scorpion have a hollow tail if there's no poison pre-fall? Was God anticipating a fall?
That is an excellent question. And in fact, it's one I was prepared to answer.
Oh,
Oh my gosh.
fantastic. I've never
This
heard
is
an
the
answer
most
to this.
nerdy moment of my life.
I went Googling for the answer for
Okay.
this. I haven't found it.
Because
So go
my
for it.
my big
You don't need
go-to
Google. You just need Max.
my big go-to species is the hermit crab, which cannot live without a snail dying
yes.
first.
You're a
and leaving
mollusk guy.
Yeah.
You're a mollusk guy.
You
Quotes
bring
from
up
today.
a scorpion tail, which is interesting to me because scorpion tail, it's called the telson, the end of it.
Yeah.
And I got popped by one about a year ago, and it
No way.
sucks.
Oh,
it
it's
really
terrible.
hurts. But they are. It's interesting because it's shaped just like the thorn on a plant. We know today almost every thorny plant has some medicinal value. Like even though it has thorns on it, there's something in the plant, something chemically that can be used for medicinal purposes.
I have a giant bougainvillea, so I want you to tell me what that is.
And so I do think, and in fact, Carl Baugh at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, he's done some research on copperhead snakes. And I forget exactly how long it took, but he put the snakes in a simulated pre-flood environment using a hyperbaric chamber. The
Pre-flood meaning not the precipitation that we
hyperoxygenized,
Okay.
right?
Right, and slightly higher barometric pressure, pushing oxygen into the skin,
Okay.
and a bunch of other different factors that I think are proprietary. But he was able to change these snakes from being very seriously venomous to being benign. Their venom
Whoa.
structure, and I can't, unless you're watching the camera, the venom structure looks like the squiggly pretzel. Like that's why it jacks you up, because it kind of collects all of your cells as it runs through your bloodstream and makes snowballs and creates blood clots. Well, when they ran the venom of these snakes after spending some time in the chambers, it looked like this. It looked like a lattice. It could go straight through your bloodstream and not harm a thing. So I suspect that
I didn't want to mention snakes because that's the one species God specifically calls out in Genesis.
Oh,
but
that's
but
true.
I didn't want to mention snakes.
But, but it's
Yeah.
going somewhere. So continue
Go
what you're
for it.
saying.
Well, I suspect that the snakes still had their fangs and that the scorpions still had their tails. I suspect that potentially, now it's a stretch, I think, to say that they could harm a human being, but I think that they may have been just like little syringes of medicine.
Medicine.
Like you get popped by a snake, you're like,
And
ouch.
wouldn't that be theologically rich for medicine to turn to poison?
Well, and that's sort of the thing.
When
It's
sin entered.
take what is good and turn it into an
Right.
evil, and that's kind of what has happened for
Yeah.
every aspect of human
Yeah.
life.
A perversion.
So I can't answer that question exactly directly, but like what you mentioned, the buzzards, they're called necrophages. They have to feed off dead things. So if there's no dead things, the buzzard's not going to live very long. So this
there was
comes,
only 6 days.
But I mean, there's tons of like carnivores that have to live off of
there are-
like, things, right?
Right.
Before the fall. But
there are many,
what I
many
mean?
species that are dependent on the death of another creature to survive, and I think that was an adaptation God did either after the fall or after the flood. And I'm not entirely sure what the mechanisms were, but I think I know the reason. You are aware of what happens when you let a deer population run, when you kill off all of the wolves and you let the deer population run wild.
are you talking about
Too many
rotting,
deer.
rotting disease? Or
Well,
what's
the
it called?
chronic wasting disease
Chronic
is
waste,
one thing,
yes,
but even worse is that I say worse, that's a terrifying thing.
Chronic
it's
wasting is crazy.
And if it jumps to humans, we are all
We're
in
screwed.
trouble.
Yeah.
That's a prion disease. Look it up.
It's a cheerful message today. Continue, though.
Well, and it's another.
So the deer run wild. We have too many deer, and then what?
Well, the deer eat all the food, and then they start to starve because when the deer population gets too big, that
There's not
creates
enough
all
food.
sorts of ecological problems. They can tip the scales on an entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
So you need those predators to keep them in check.
The axis deer on the not the big island, but one of the islands of Hawaii are currently doing this, and that's why they bring in so many hunters.
Yeah.
Because deer wreck an ecosystem when they're brought in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think when the earth was paradisical, when God was present there and more or less running the show, things were kept in perfect balance. When God withdrew, because the separation of God from his creation, that's essentially why we're suffering. Well, he had to put systems in place in order to keep that balance, and I believe that that's why he transformed. He beautifully engineered some animals to be killing machines. Like, there's no doubt. You look at a great white shark, that thing is made to kill and eat.
You're saying that God had a hand in animal death after the fall,
I do.
but I mean, depending on how you feel about the Canaanite conquest, you would say that God had a hand in human versus human death after the fall too.
Sure.
If you follow specific narratives around that.
Well, some
Not
of
very
us
cheery.
think, let me not go there. Yeah, you'll have to go back and listen to our conversation with Adam Harger if you want to talk about the conquests. But that's really interesting, and it's an interesting theological answer to what normally gets just bucketed into scientific conversation. So,
And it's either God did this before the fall in anticipation of it, or God did it immediately after the fall in anticipation of the tons of animal biodiversity that would
Yes.
need culling.
Exactly.
well, then there is a middle. I mean, we don't have a old Earth creationist here, but I think the middle position would be something like there was death before the fall, but there wasn't spiritual death, right? There
Well,
was
that's
physical
the big
death,
question.
but there wasn't spiritual death.
If it could be proven that when the New Testament says, and death came through one man's sin, or death came through sin, sin through one man, if that death was purely the spiritual death of a human being to be condemned to hell forever, or something other than his body failing and ceasing to live, that would definitely change my perspective. But
Yeah.
I see more evidence to say that that death absolutely refers to physical as well as spiritual death, and for animals as well.
Yeah. Interesting.
With the words like nefesh, the presence of the spirit's defined as the breath of life. And in Genesis 7, I think, when it's describing the flood, it says, "And everything upon the earth
With breath.
with
which is-
breath in
yeah.
his nostrils died," and that includes all the animals. It's the nefesh, it's the spirit.
Which begs the question about insects, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Insects
I
are
mean,
kind of,
Yeah, they don't have breath in their lungs. They have it in their thorax.
In the
but
spiracles.
It's weird.
I can't. No, I'm not going to say that because I don't know for sure.
Well, I'm guessing there's some poetic language that even someone that sees that as historical narrative
Well, I
can
mean, the breath of life.
assent to the fact that there's poetic
all
language
of us,
there.
all of us pro-lifers are fine talking about like an umbilical cord bringing that breath of life into
Yeah.
a fetus,
Right.
right? Even though it's not like breath in the lungs, it's still oxygenating the blood.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We have just a couple minutes before we
Dang it.
finish this. So if either of you had something you were jonesing to talk about, now is the time. Did you?
I mentioned the human hominid and Australopith fossil record earlier. I did just want to ask you where you fit Australopiths and like Homo, the early Homos, Florensis, Habilis, Homo naledi, because it's really fun talking to young Earth creationists because they all bucket them differently. Some will look at Lucy and say, well, that's just an ape, right?
Yeah.
I've heard that Lucy is a combination of different.
No, you're thinking of Nebraska Man or Piltdown Man?
I think Piltdown.
Piltdown
Yeah.
Man was
Okay.
a combination. Yeah.
He was a hoax as well.
Yeah, very. Yeah.
You don't think Lucy was?
Lucy was not a
No,
hoax,
no, no,
but
no, no.
Lucy was
Okay.
also not a human.
It was an Australopith, and the question is, was this ancient extinct ape just an ape, or was it a, did it share a common ancestry with humans is the question. You think it was just an ape?
I do believe it was an ape, especially because of the tendon hooks show it was a primarily arboreal species.
Yeah, it was well adapted for arboreal, but the basal, what's it called, the basal angle of the foramen magnum, which is the hole at the back of the skull, right, that shows where the not the vertebrae, but the vertebral artery, right, the arteries and the stuff that goes into your skull and goes down
Into the spine.
your nervous system into your
Right.
spine, right? That angle, right, tells you how frequently it walked upright.
Okay.
So like chimps and gorillas and like the knuckle walkers have a very like angular
Yeah.
foramen magnum, the hole in the back of the skull, and Australopith might have been the first ape that walked upright. Very arboreal, but
Sure.
also might have been like an upright tree walker or like spent its time between the trees. And
Land.
taxonomically, you don't like calling human apes, right?
I don't. I think, categorically they could be
That's what I'm saying.
primates.
Primates, two breasts. They have.
I'm willing to say they're mammals for sure.
Big brain case
we're
size.
mammal as an adjective.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would say that we're not animals, biblically speaking.
Sure.
And then if I'm being practical, it's like we're very, very animal
Yeah.
in our physical composition.
But like, where do you bucket? Because going from Australopith, which some young Earth creationists say like it is an early human, but most say it's an ape.
Yeah.
To like the early Homos.
Sure.
Every time you say it, my fifth
Sorry.
grade, fifth grade boy brain's like, ha ha ha.
Yeah,
that's
no. I'm just thinking like Homo naledi or Homo erectus is Homo erectus. Everyone agrees is a human, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. Cool. But then there's
Same
the-
with habilis.
Habilis is a very small human, and Homo naledi is real in between. Homo florensis is like in between naledi and Australopith, and
Right.
it's real fuzzy when you get in between. And that's where like it's a toss up for
So
young
what is
Earth
your question for
creationists.
Max? How does he account for those kind of in-betweens?
How do you account for the in betweens? And just out of pure curiosity, how do you bucket them? Like
What do you call them?
where do you bucket which ones?
Well, I would.
Yeah.
I don't have the papers with me right now to say this one is this. This
Sure,
one is
sure,
that.
sure.
In general, it's either fully human or it's some sort of ape.
Right.
And so
Different created kinds.
Right, different entirely whole different categories. And one thing to remember about a lot of these species is that some of the hominids and stuff, all that we have from some of them is fragments. And we do the best we can with the fragments, but we don't have the whole picture.
But you know this from dinosaurs. Like we very often.
Oh
get
yeah, there's some dinosaurs we
fragments
know
of
from
dino-
like a jawbone, and that's
Right.
it, which is kind of disappointing.
It's
Is
so
it
disappointing.
true? I was just talking to someone the other day that was saying that like a brontosaurus doesn't actually exist. Because
It's
it's-
back, baby.
Oh, yeah?
Brontosaurus has been reestablished as its own genera.
Because before it was sort of a a combining of different.
It was
bones that-
originally,
yeah,
it
okay.
was, I think, a Diplodocus skull on an Apatosaurus body, or I may have had that other
They're
way
all
around.
sauropods.
Yeah, they're
Yeah,
sauropods.
yeah.
But I believe the last time I looked it up, it was reestablished as a legitimate a genus of sauropod, which is
Okay.
very exciting.
Really fun. Yeah.
So to answer his question, you just say they're either human or they're ape.
Correct.
And there's certain
But-
bone structures, hip
Sure.
like orientations that you would foramen magnum angle.
That'll have to
vertibular-
look into the details, but like there are plenty of animals that have very human qualities. Like the
Sure.
giant squid has an extremely human eyeball.
The eyeballs in mollusks,
Hmm.
dude. Creationists used to say this.
It's almost
thing.
like the same entity was designing all these things.
Creationists would always say the irreducibly complex eye.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you're a mollusk guy, right? Even you could give the evolutionary perspective on how eyes evolved, because the mollusk eyes
Hmm.
didn't evolve with like rods and cones, right? There's only like one type of rod in the what was it called? It was called the photoreceptor layers,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
We have like rods and cones like other mammals. Dogs have a different kind, which
Yeah.
is why they have like a different
Reflective
color
retina.
spectrum, right? But like cephalopods and squids and octopuses. How do you
Octopi?
what's the plural?
Oh gosh, I think it's octopodes. actually.
Octopodes or octopodes. Yeah, exactly. They have one type of rod, but squids and octopuses are very, very human-like in the like convergent evolution, like
Mhm.
that you can see going back to a nautilus, which doesn't have a the nautilus eye, right?
I'm not familiar.
In nautilus, the a nautilus.
Well, I know what the nautilus
Yeah.
is.
So Nautilus eye doesn't have a what's it called?
Eyelid?
Not the eyelid. but-
Nictitating membrane.
Very
Sure.
good. That's impressive.
I want to
Awesome.
throw some big words in here
It
too.
doesn't have a membrane over it.
Okay.
It's a cavity of water,
Oh.
but it still has those nerves, those optical nerve layers in the back.
So it's just like a light sensor.
Exactly.
'Cause
Which
that-
it looks.
it goes up and down to the benthic to the pelagic layer every
Listen,
night.
I need y'all to re-listen to this podcast with a drink in your hand, and every time you hear a word you've never heard before today, take a drink, and at the end of the podcast, go to our Give page and make a donation.
And
That's what I'm going to suggest.
And
Yeah.
just like tons of the gastropods that you love, right? There's varying degrees of complexity of the eyes,
Yeah.
right? So when like creationists would point to evolution and say, you can't explain the eye, it's too
Mhm.
complex. You can't get anywhere with half an eye. I was like, what? Animals get like all over the place with half an eye
Yeah.
all the time.
Even
Funny.
lizards have a third eye technically at the top of their
Moths
head.
And they're
too.
like right above the pineal gland.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, it's a
Okay,
light, it's a
y'all
light sensor.
have devolved, pun
Sorry.
intended.
Okay,
So
what's the one
mean.
thing that you wanted to bring
Yes.
up?
Well,
Yeah.
I just sort of bring it back to the original about the trial and
Yeah.
say that I would not call it the monkey trial, I'd call it the Great Red Herring trial.
Hey,
Okay.
Because-
nice. Well done.
Because originally the trial was, did this guy break the law as it was written? And it devolved into sort of the creation evolution debate and absolutely shredding William Jennings Bryan on the stand when he considered himself a biblical expert. He got up, he got hit with
He
like,
got demolished.
Who did Cain marry? And he's like, I don't.
Poor
And
guy.
he said, I don't
Yeah.
think about the things I don't think about, which was the wrong thing to say on the
Nope.
stand.
That
And
is also true. It's
and
better than making up some
the
BS,
journalist
you know?
suggested he died of shame and a broken heart.
Oh.
Well, you're a lot better looking than Williams Jennings
Oh,
Bryan. I
well.
don't expect you to die soon.
I appreciate it.
Hopefully, I'm better looking than Darrow. Like
But I would say
Both
that,
of you are very handsome. Okay.
yeah, Darrow is
like
what a friend of mine calls eye broccoli.
Oh my gosh.
you and I got tons of life left in us, so we're not going to die
Yeah,
anytime soon.
Well, and I'm
Lord
shocked that we
willing.
didn't get into today things like separation of church and state.
I
and
wish
what
we could
should
have,
be.
yeah.
Maybe another time.
Well, the one thing I want to bring up is that the big question about the Scopes trial is, does a Christian population have the right to control what is and what is not taught in its community?
Yeah.
And back then, the way that the debate was framed, it was these stupid country bumpkins, these backward
Yeah.
people. The Bible's the only book they know how to read, were versus us erudite, educated, scientific, rational skeptics. And it was a very vicious sort of
Darrow was mean.
juxtaposition.
He was as
oh, he
mean
was
as
a
Bryan.
jerk.
Yeah, like
So is H.L. Mencken, the guy who actually appointed Darrow to be the defense. He's viciously hateful
Yeah.
of anything
Hmm.
related to Christianity or the South.
Hmm.
But I think I would love to revisit this question maybe on another podcast.
Yeah.
How much is sort of, I guess it goes back to the 10th Amendment.
we talked about this in the Christian nationalism one,
It's,
right?
it is very Christian nationalist. It's like, do we have the right to determine as a community
For our
what-
community.
Yeah.
How
What's
big is
best
the community?
for
Is it
us?
as big as Tennessee?
That's the big question.
Exactly.
That's something.
Go
I'd love
watch
to
our
revisit.
debate on Christian nationalism and Christian anarchy. It's really fun.
So
Watch all of our podcasts. They're all
Right?
fun.
Yeah. Go check our back catalog.
Okay, well, if people want to pick y'all's brains more about this, where can people find you? I know you're going to say, you jokers can't find me anywhere unless you come to our events.
I'm not telling you guys where I work.
So, yes, if you want to talk to Ken more, you have to come. I don't know when this is going to air, but we have events every month. So, August 14th, we're going to be in the Woodlands. September 20th, we're doing our big annual fundraiser, and we're celebrating 10 years as Theology by the Pint / Theology on Tap. And then on and on. October, November, December, we have events every month. So go to theologybythepint.org to find out when you can talk to Ken about all the ways you disagree with him. Max, where can people find you?
you can find me at a website called maxedoutdesign.com or sister website molluskman.com. And now
Mollusk
I'm going to
Man
have
is
to.
awesome.
I'm gonna have-
Maxed Out Design is where
Is
you can
maxed
get
out
one of these
1X
babies.
or 2?
It's 1X.
Okay.
Well, I'm clearly now going to have to add a page to my mollusk website about the eyeballs now.
Bro.
Okay. And of course, I'm Sarah Stone Ulrich, and you can find me and all of the other leadership and board for Theology by the Pint on our website, theologybythepint.org. And until we see you next time, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.